Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help.
Podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who have experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about sex after sexual assault. My name is Emilie Mitchell, and I am the Education Coordinator at the Victim Service Center. With me today, I have Jorge Valladares. Jorge is a professor of psychology at Valencia College and teaches general psychology, developmental psychology, and human sexuality. He has master's degrees in general psychology and clinical mental health counseling. Jorge was also a Rollins College Social Justice pre-practicum intern with the VSC in 2019. Jorge, thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And I also have returning Alexa Andino. Alexa is our therapy intern here at the VSC. She will be graduating with her master's in clinical mental health counseling in December. Alexa will like to continue working with sexual abuse survivors and believes sex after sexual assault should be talked about more often. Alexa hopes to educate more survivors about embracing your own sex life after an assault and how to move towards healing. Alexa, thanks for returning to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here again.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you both. I think it's a really important one and honestly one that I haven't thought of before. So I'm really excited to have it. And as a brief introduction, on this podcast, as people know, we talk a lot about the effects of trauma, the effect that trauma and sexual assault can have on survivors, which may include physical, psychological, and social impacts, among others. So what we're looking to explore in this episode is sex after sexual assault. So with that in mind, Alexa, I wanted to kind of start off first. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose to work with clients who have survived sexual assault?
Yes, I can. I've met many people in my life who have been sexually assaulted, and I noticed one common theme within all these stories, and that theme was secrecy. I believe sexual assault is not talked about enough, and I felt that I needed to advocate for survivors of sexual assault who do not have their voice yet. Many people believe that after a sexual assault happens, it is over with and that victim can move on, but that is never the case. Many victims of sexual assault suffer from the trauma they experience, and this can manifest in many dimensions in that person's life, with sex just being one of them, and sex not even being talked about in our society, but especially not being talked about after a sexual assault happens. So my passion grew to help victims who have survived one of the most traumatic experiences they can go through, which is sexual assault. My job as a therapist is to install hope in them that growth and change is possible.
Wonderful. Beautifully said. And thank you so much for sharing that. Jorge, I wanted to ask if you can give a brief description of the components of your course on human sexuality.
Sure, I can. And I think before I do that, though, I think one of the things that's really important, I get a lot of questions about this. Well, what's that class about? And one of the things I've started to do, and I do this at the beginning of every class, is really emphasize the values of the course. This is, there's some really tough content to go through in that class with the group, Everyone arrives at the class with different experiences, different ideas, different beliefs about sex and sexuality. And one of the things I like to do right at the top is establish some values for the course. So one of the things that's really important for students to know when they come in is we use something called the 13 Principles of Peace and Justice. It's created by the Valencia College's Peace and Justice Institute, and it's just the way that you interact with each other. And one of the things that's really important in those principles is that all voices have value. It recognizes that people are arriving with different experiences and different ideas and different beliefs. So I like to do that early. I like to talk about the fact that I'm really taking a rights-based approach to comprehensive sexuality education. And so that's a really important thing. And I go through a couple of different principles, and really high in there is about the right to be free from abuse and violence and non-consensual sexual activity. So that's really right up at the top, along with gender diversity, along with the right of having sex and using sex as a part of our personal wellness. So those things happen really early in the course, distinguishing, what is healthy sex versus, coercive sex and things like that. And so then we can go into topics like, the history and perspectives and research on sexuality, sexual anatomy, sexual response, gender issues, gender diversity. We talk about human development a lot. So sexuality through the lifespan. Trauma plays a big role in that. If you can understand, human development, then you can understand how trauma might affect an individual differently at different points of their life. So we talk about some of that as well. We talk about love and communication and intimacy also, which is kind of the topic of our talk today. So it's a really broad, really interesting course, and it's never the same. Depending on what group of people you have, depending on what the experiences and attitudes and ideas are, it's a unique experience each semester. I've had a really great time with the course.
Sounds like a wonderful course, and really broad too, which is really exciting. Are there any misconceptions about human sexuality in general as a course that you wanted to break down before?
Oh goodness, there's so well. The idea of misconception would imply that there's a right answer, and so people come in with different ideas about sex, and I openly share where I'm coming from, the messages that I got growing up and what that has meant for me in my life. So I'm honest about that. We have texts and research that we draw from as well, and hopefully we arrive at some new place by the end of the semester. Whether or not I'm clearing misconceptions, I don't know. I hope so. Are there myths and facts about rape, for example? Yes, there are. And do some people come in with myths that are guiding their ideas about rape? Absolutely. Do I think it's helpful when I introduce research that provides evidence that looks a little bit different? Yeah, I think I like it when that happens. And sometimes that shifts the thinking of the students in the class. At least that's what I hope.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I wish I could take your class.
You can.
Oh, okay. Maybe I will.
And actually, one of the things I do in this course, I'm really supported in this class by community partners. And in addition to me working with victim services in the past, I've also had Victim Services Center come into my class, and we've done this each semester. I'm also supported by Planned Parenthood, comes into my course. So I've got lots of community partners that come in. I'm not the sole source of education. Q Latinx has been great for us also. So I'm supported by those organizations, and listeners, I recommend you support those organizations as well.
Awesome. I think that it's a really diverse class, very important. So Alexa, I wanted to ask you, what are some common themes to how people approach sex after a sexual assault that you would like to address?
So I do have a few common themes that I notice within a lot of clients. The most common theme being that you hear about hypersexuality or compulsive sexual behavior. So some survivors of sexual assault may have the feeling to take back control of their own bodies, and they may do this by participating in many compulsive sex acts. I would like to express that whatever we do with our bodies is our choice, but I do want to express the importance of protection through condoms when survivors do choose to experience sex again. The second theme I see is when a survivor dissociates during sex. So dissociation is not feeling connected to your own body, and someone does this by checking out. They might even have this kind of out-of-body experience where they are watching themselves having sex, but do not feel connected in their bodies at that time. Dissociation is a learned behavior that happens naturally when we experience a traumatic event, but it is not okay to continue it after the traumatic event because it can slow down the recovery process. So if you as a viewer notice you do this during sex, I would definitely consult with your therapist about this because it can definitely be helped. The other theme that I do see with sexual assault survivors is opposite of hypersexuality, which is complete avoidance. So some survivors might be scared to experience anything sexual because of their abuse. They might choose to avoid sex because it makes them feel safer. But the issue with that is that the survivor does not feel in control of their sexuality, and they might feel powerless when it comes to sex. I also like to just express as well that some survivors become confused about their sexual orientation as a result of sexual assault. Some people might have this thought that they say to themselves that they must be gay because they were molested by a male. One thing I like to remind my clients is that sex orientation is made up of you and not others. So when a perpetrator, for example, molests you, that is a reflection on his sexual orientation if he identifies as male and not yours. So I always like to express that with my clients because I do see that is a common theme, especially with male clients that I have seen before in the past.
All really good points. And what I'm hearing is that just like other effects and how other impacts, they're all individual. And so not everyone's going to react to trauma the same way. Not everyone's going to approach sex after a sexual assault the same way. So I really appreciate you breaking down all the common themes that we see.
I wanted to add to that too, that you made some really great points about how some of this can be unhealthy and also interfere with healing, right? This is a tricky thing, thinking about like, how do I continue a sexual life? How do I continue to grow sexually when I've had this traumatic event? How do I separate the two? There's a lot of behavior also that faces that's stigmatizing as well. A lot of the things that you talked about, there are a lot of myths around that stuff too. So, these ideas about someone who does choose same-sex relationships do so because of traumatic sexual past or something like that. That's a myth that gets floated out there. It's a stigmatizing myth. There's another stigma around certain types of sexual behavior. So there's some belief that, because I practice, let's take, our BDSM community, for example, there's a stigma around that in some way is unhealthy sexual behavior, and it's the result of a sexual assault or something like that, which is a myth. It's something that certainly we deal with in the class, but something that we should know about. I mean, there are some characteristics of unhealthy sexual behavior. I would strongly recommend seeing a counselor like yourself, seeing a professional that knows how to look at some of these behaviors, because some of them really, there are a lot of myths that surround sexual behavior and often are interpreted as like the result of a traumatic sexual past.
Definitely. All great points. And actually that leads me to my other question, Jorge, which is, does your course delve into sexual assault at all?
Yeah, very much so. So one of the things that happens early on in the class is talking about what is consensual and non-consensual sexual behavior. That it remains ever present. As we're going through all of the content in the class, I'm always kind of checking, in whether or not this is, what we're talking about. How does consent play a role in what we're talking about? And actually, I've already mentioned it. One of our other community partners, the Woodshed, comes in. They are a BDSM club in Orlando. They come in and talk a little bit about what members do and how they distinguish BDSM from non-consensual sex, and their whole talk is about consent. So even when we're not talking about sexual assault and rape, we are. It's permeated through all of the topics in the class. And then we spend a lot of time looking at sexual assault directly, differentiating between types and acts and the impact at different ages and stages. We talk about wartime rape. We talk about the rape from acquaintances and stranger rape. And so we look very carefully, very closely at the topic of rape and sexual assault and try to distinguish it very clearly from healthy sexual behavior, healthy sexual development.
That makes a lot of sense, especially when you're talking about consent. It would just naturally come up, bringing up non-consensual acts such as sexual assault. I wanted to throw it back at you, Alexa. So when counseling someone, what specific things do you emphasize for a victim of sexual assault who is wanting to explore sexual relationships?
I would emphasize to being patient and compassionate with yourself. It's definitely such a big moment for you to regain power of your own body and your own sex life, especially for a childhood sexual abuse victim, because most likely their first sexual activity was their abuse. So to take control of having your first consensual experience with sex is very important. I always suggest to my clients, exploring taking control of your own body, through masturbation, if that's something that you feel comfortable with, getting to really understand and know your own body, because that's a person that you feel safe and trusted with. And then to also educate yourself, on your body and what are different ways that you can feel in touch with yourself and explore sex with yourself. I believe, learning about your own body and how it works and experiences pleasure can be a good step in exploring sexual relationships. I think the relationship with yourself is the first step most survivors can do to feel empowered. But of course, there's other ways that you can do it with other people, but that could take a lot of trust and that could take, some time to form those relationships where you do feel safe with.
And how wonderful it can be too when you have a supporting and trusting partner. If we're talking about a partnered relationship and partnered sex, what a great opportunity that could be for a couple in counseling too. So I think, Alexa, you'll also see maybe couples, I imagine in your future, and what a special thing it would be to help a couple really achieve a satisfactory, intimate relationship when there's been sexual assault for one or both.
In the future, or even working with clients and couples, I do think, sex is something that people just think is normal, that we should all be sexual beings. And sometimes it's difficult when a couple has that issue that their sex life isn't how it should be, like in the movies or how you hear about it. So being able to really, go through this as a couple can make you even become stronger. So I definitely think, therapy is the way to go with, being able to work on that with your partner and instilling that trust and safety as well.
Yeah. I want to add something from another qualification I have. I've been with my wife. My wife was my girlfriend when I was 13 years old. And so we've actually been together through like developmental stages. And this idea of a sex life, that's constantly being negotiated and renegotiated. And it requires conversation and trust and openness. And there are often barriers of our, that we have from our personal experiences outside of the relationship. And I think it could be really, really healing for someone when you have a supportive partner that is patient and willing to listen, willing to take their time, and willing to take the time that it takes to build trust.
Definitely. And it's always a good reminder for everyone listening that the Victim Service Center also supports and is able to provide services for secondary survivors or victims. Those are those people who are the loved ones of the ones who went through the trauma or the sexual assault. So definitely want to plug that in too. Jorge, I wanted to ask you, can you describe the connection between psychological and physical reactions to sexual trauma? Sure.
That's a big question. It's a big question because it can be so different for each of us, how we might experience a traumatic event, period. Alexa described some really interesting symptoms before. She talked a little bit about dissociation, which is kind of a psychological symptom. And I'll say that if we're looking at this from an evolutionary standpoint, your brain is better designed for keeping you safe than it is for keeping you happy. And so a lot of the mechanisms that it's developed have been developed to keep you safe. So, when you hear someone talk about dissociative symptoms or compulsive behavior that seems harmful on the surface, if you dig a little bit deeper, you recognize that it's not completely unfounded. There's good reasons why some of those things happen. From a psychological standpoint, and I'm setting aside the biological piece for just a moment. From a psychological standpoint, the way that might appear to us in terms of dissociative symptoms, Alexa was talking about that out-of-body experience, depersonalization, right? This is not happening to me right now. I'm seeing this happen to somebody else. You could have complete dissociation, which is like being cut off. And very often people think, okay, I recognize this person is a victim of sexual assault. That must mean that they have post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's not always true. It doesn't always just stop there. Dissociative disorders are things that often result from severe sexual trauma. And a lot of it begins with some of these symptoms, this dissociation, derealization, depersonalization. And a lot of that comes from our body's response to the trauma, to a highly stressful event. Another thing that can happen we're still looking at kind of psychological things. It can also depend on the event and the meaning that's given to the event of the rape. Was this an acquaintance, for example? Was it a family member? Was it someone that I already had a trusting relationship with that was then the perpetrator, that was then my abuser? You can imagine what that might do to our thoughts about trust and love and relationships. So if you think about like acquaintance rape, this is someone it wasn't the danger from somewhere out there. It was the danger from right in here, right inside these walls. And so you can almost imagine what would happen to an individual who experiences that level of betrayal and experiences that level of trauma. And on a biological level, it is really a remarkable, explosive thing that occurs when we experience something so traumatic. I mean, this is, if you think about sexual assault and rape, this is something that's so harmful to us that what it does is that very often it will set off a stress reaction. Some of you recognize this as fight, flight, and freeze. And essentially what's happening, first you have kind of a hormonal response that takes place that's intended to increase your energy if you have to fight or fly. And again, this isn't true for everybody, but the hormones that are often secreted are intended to increase energy, suppress pain, which is a major component, and that can produce an affect that people sometimes interpret as compliance, as going along, as consent in some cases. It can appear. You also have opioids that can be released into the bloodstream as well, and so that would explain some of the confusion that might occur around this. So you have this hormones managing mood, managing pain, managing energy. And often what will happen is that will interfere with the process of encoding memory. And this can be problematic as well, because a lot of times when you think about a sexual assault, if law enforcement is called, if it's reported in some way, it becomes difficult to kind of handle the reporting of it because memory is so impaired in the case of this stress response. So you have this flooding of hormones. It's impairing memory encoding and consolidation. And our memory encoding and consolidation are very sensitive to our hormonal levels. Emotional memory is really complex, really difficult for our brain to organize. And what will happen very often when you have this very high stress response, you have this fractured kind of memory. And so rather than, for example, what you're having right now is you're listening to this, you may be organizing some of this information. Maybe you're sitting in your car, you're sitting in your office. And if this isn't charging emotions for you, if it isn't creating emotions for you, your brain is probably having a pretty easy time of organizing what's happening right now. However, if we increase your stress levels, it becomes more difficult for your brain to organize what's happening in this moment. And so a lot of times with these dissociative kind of symptoms, you also have memory symptoms. So if you look at like the classification of dissociative disorders, you'll see impaired memory or fractured memory is an important piece of dissociation. So, and there's, some other stuff. If we look at like the larger brain structures, we know that the amygdala plays a major role in trauma. We have high activation of the amygdala. The hippocampus, which is responsible for consolidation of memory, can be affected by the amount of these hormones that are in the bloodstream at the moment. Another thing that can happen is that rather than the increased energy and the ability to fight or fly, you might have that freeze response. So for some of us, they call this tonic immobility. It is literally a paralysis, and it's something that can often happen. And this is one of the things that become really confusing, is that for some of us, when we have this really high stress response, and there's been a lot of research around this, if you ask someone when they're not stressed what they would do if they were being sexually assaulted, they would say things like, oh, I would fight, I would kick, I would run, I would do this, I would do that. But what we're talking about here are autonomic responses. We're talking about things that we don't have conscious, goal-directed control over. For example, you probably remember this game from when you were a kid. Let's see who can hold their breath the longest, right? So that, so we hold our breath and we try and we try and we try, but at some point our body is going to take over and take a breath. So we're talking about responses at that level, at the autonomic level, something we don't have control over. And so that freeze response is something that can happen in a sexual assault and is very commonly misinterpreted for consent.
All really, really good points. Thank you for breaking that down beautifully there on the effects of trauma. Alexa, I wanted to ask you, do you find survivors have more primary physical damage like tearing or bruising, or do you find they are more likely to develop secondary damage such as dyspareunia or painful sex from overactive pelvic floor muscles, erectile dysfunction, or other physical manifestations?
After a sexual assault, there could be physical damage to the area that was penetrated by the perpetrator, but that might not always be the case. And although not every survivor experiences sexual difficulties after assault, there are common documented problems such as low desire for sex, difficulty with arousal, problems with orgasm, and sexual pain. These are the secondary damage manifestations you were talking about, and it's important to talk to your doctor if you are experiencing any of these difficulties. Somatization is the development of physical responses to abuse, and to talk briefly about somatization is that our body keeps memories, and it is common that survivors of sexual abuse will also keep the trauma in their physical body, where this can manifest in pelvic floor tension, tightening of the glutes or thighs, or many other physical conditions that are known to cause sexual dysfunction. So it's important to understand that sexual dysfunction is not the result of sexual abuse, and that anyone can develop a sexual dysfunction without any abuse history. There are many sexual dysfunctions, and we could be here all day talking about them, but it's important to know that if we do experience anything out of the ordinary with sex, to consult a primary care physician or a gynecologist to be physically evaluated before you decide it's something that is mentally wrong.
Definitely.
Those are such great points. And that made me think, along with kind of like what I was sharing about some of the reactions in the nervous system, along with what Alexa was sharing. If you have this traumatic experience, well, let me just talk about memory for a moment. Like a lot of times we have this idea that memory is like this perfect video of the things that have come before us, and that's not the function it serves. Again, looking from just a purely evolutionary standpoint, our memory is used to keep us alive, right? It's to help us recognize friends, family, foes. It's to help us remember what food nourishes us, what things harm us, right? This is the function of memory. It keeps you going, it keeps you alive. And so when you're, kind of like you said, Alexa, that the body has a memory, we do. So if in a sexual assault, if we have that reaction I kind of described, that memory is stored, not just not just the sensory memory for what happened, but also the internal physiological response. And one of the things that can feed these symptoms is, so I'm no longer in this threatening situation. I'm in a consensual, intimate relationship, but for some reason, my body is still undergoing these autonomic responses. It learned it in this first event, and now they're being repeated over and over again. So there is a part of this that's not rational. It's not, I might recognize that this person in front of me loves me and doesn't want to harm me. But I can't control my autonomic responses. They take over, and they're doing things that make it difficult to control. And so, and for us, we see that as symptoms that Alexa described.
Definitely. All really good points, Jorge. I also wanted to ask you, what are some of the socio-cultural factors that play into sexuality, and what impact might those factors play in healing post-assault?
Gosh, there's so much of our sexuality that is culturally defined. One of the things, one of the reasons I love working with Victim Service Center, and I tell this story often, that I didn't realize how much my upbringing contributed to my ideas about coupling and relationships and sex and things like that. And it took me a while to be able to see it from other perspectives, and my perspective continues to shift. I grew up in the kind of household where, like when we'd have a party, all the aunts would come over, and, as I was getting a little bit older, they thought I was adorable and cute, and they'd say, do you have a girlfriend? And then they would ask, well, how many? And maybe that was cute then, but that was sending me messages about sexuality and about my sexuality particularly. And so these little events, these little messages do ultimately craft some idea about sex and sexuality. And what we've seen in our, and I'll just talk about our American culture, is that I grew up in Brooklyn, and I'm a Hispanic guy from Brooklyn, and you can edit you can bleep this out later, but you don't with a guy from Brooklyn, right? That tells you something, that sends you a message of entitlement, of I'm gonna get what I want, I'm gonna get what's mine, and that translates into ideas about sex and sexuality. During this pandemic, just the other day, I wanted to watch old films that I had liked when I was younger, and I watched the film Rocky. You familiar with the film Rocky? You're a little young, but yes. Rocky is so Rocky 1, which was I think like 1977, the year that I was born. There's a scene in Rocky. Adrian is, his famous love. If you watch the scene of their first date, Rocky is actually not letting her leave his apartment. And that is, watch it again. I recommend you go back and watch it. But if you look at it, and that ended up being a romantic experience, watch it through today's lens, and you'll get a sense for this, how the messaging might contribute to ideas about sex and sexuality. So I think culture plays a major role in our ideas about this. And if we scale that up, if you think about like healing from sexual assault, another thing that tends to happen culturally is how we treat survivors of sexual assault. In some cultures, your family will disown you as a survivor of sexual assault. And you know what? I think people will hate me for saying something like this, but I feel like one of the crimes of my generation, I was a teenager in the 90s, and one of the big regrets that I have is that I didn't pay enough attention to what was happening in Rwanda at the time. These mass rapes, this raping and mutilation of mostly women and girls. And in a lot, we could say the same thing about Darfur in Sudan, Congo, more recently. And for a lot of these victims, Saudi Arabia recently as well, for a lot of these victims, it wasn't traumatic enough that they were brutally assaulted, but for many of them returning home, if it was known that they were victims of rape, many of them were disavowed, disowned, kicked out of their homes. And so the trauma very often continues. I'm naming other countries of the world, but that happens here too. In some circles, we have a tendency to blame victims. We have a tendency to say that it was wanted or deserved. And so the way that if a person who survives a sexual assault is in an environment that is not supportive of them, that engages in victim blaming, they're more likely to have difficulty with surviving the trauma and then engaging in healthy behaviors after the traumatic event, because it's continuing trauma. And this is why it's so important for us to talk about this, to have comprehensive sexuality education, to do things, actually to have Victim Service Center, to have celebrations like Denim Day, because we know that if as a supportive culture, we're helping the people to get back on their feet, that we're not victim blaming, that we're supporting healing, that ultimately improves outcomes for survivors.
Definitely. I think victim blaming plays a huge role in the healing process, and we can all do our best to be more mindful before we respond to when someone discloses. And we could probably have a whole podcast about that too. But yeah, definitely great points. Alexa, I wanted to check with you. What team members, healthcare or otherwise, do you bring in for clients who would benefit from physical or spiritual healing in addition to mental healing?
It is extremely important to have a team of clinicians for each sexual abuse client who is having concerns with sex. It's important for the counselor to be sex positive, but the counselor is not going to have the adequate training to help a client with a sexual dysfunction if there is one. So it's important to look for a therapist who identifies as a certified sex therapist. These are going to be practitioners who have taken extra amount of training and education to specialize in sex therapy. And then along with, having a sex therapist as well, it's important to have a team made up of a gynecologist or a primary health provider just to check out if anything physically is wrong there, a physical therapist. A client might be participating in pelvic floor physical therapy for any vaginismus they might have or any other dysfunctions, and then a urologist if needed. And if the client is spiritual, they can also have a spiritual healer on their team as well. But I think having a well-connected team that is integrative medicine, I think is going to be the best solution for clients who are coming in for any kind of sexual dysfunctions or anything that they would like to work on for their sexual healing journey.
Yeah, absolutely. All really important. And things that I didn't think about before. So I really appreciate that. Jorge, more research and literature is coming out about sexual health, such as The Body Keeps the Score. Do you have any specific books or articles on the subject that you utilize in your courses?
So I love that work that by Vander Kolk. That is fundamental reading for anyone who's interested in trauma. Period. I mean, sexual assault, it can inform your awareness of the impact of sexual assault. If you have family members that undergo post-traumatic stress, the veterans in your family or your circle of friends, you could learn a lot about what that experience is like by reading that text. So I think that's a fundamental text. I'm cheating a little bit because I have an assignment in the class where students get to choose something that they get to educate us on something as a group. And one group did this project exactly, which was and they came up with it. I didn't propose it. Intimacy after sexual assault, and they gave us these really great resources. They showed us these 2 TED Talks they showed us snippets from them, but I love these. These help to inform me a lot. It really helped me kind of understand this issue just a little bit more. One is by Kat Smith. It's actually called Intimacy After Trauma. And there's another really impactful one by T Ortiz. Her first name is just T, Exploring Sexuality After Trauma. Those had a huge impact on me. There's one that I recommend. Actually, this was when I did training, and if you're not a volunteer for a victim service center, you should definitely look into it. It's a really great experience. One of the things they require you to do to become a volunteer, there's a pretty comprehensive training that you have to do. And I remember that, going through that training, it helped me to think about the relationship between sexual assault survivors and law enforcement and how those 2 things are involved. And there was a source in there in one of the works that pointed to this other training by the Department of Justice. And I'm going to get you the information here. It was called The Neurobiology of Sexual Assault: Implications for Law Enforcement, Prosecution, and Victim Advocacy. And the speaker was Rebecca Campbell. And it's a long one, but really, really fruitful for anyone who's thinking about advocacy or law enforcement. I mean, it's a really powerful talk. There's also a really good, like if that's a little too deep for you and you want something that will give you a really good understanding. So I described some biology for you, and I described some psychology for you. If you're interested in more of like the psychological impact, the stuff that we can kind of see in survivors, there's this really great 2013 article by Mason and Lodrick are the names. Psychological Consequences of Sexual Assault, 2013. These are really good, I think, consumable bits of research that would help. You don't need any kind of training to really take advantage of these. If you're just getting started in trying to understand sexual assault and life after sexual assault, these are, I think, 4 good places to begin.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I'll be sure to put in those into the comment section here. So if people want to take a look and have some, summer reading and things that would be really helpful for people, especially who want to become more of that advocate that you were mentioning, Jorge. Absolutely. Alexa, in your experience as a counselor, do you find the path back to having healthy sexual relationships is linear? And what are some things that may cause a regression of healing?
Of course, everyone's going to be different, especially discussing about sex. Everyone's sex life is going to be different, but in most cases, it's definitely not going to be linear. It's going to be common to have blocks in an individual's sexual healing journey after an assault. Just like what we say about therapy, our healing is not linear and life isn't linear in general, so some things that may cause regressions are, forming new relationships. If the client or the survivor hasn't been in a relationship since the sexual assault, that can be something that can be an obstacle for them. Any medical diagnosis, such as what we discussed before in the past, any exposure to sexual abuse again, flashbacks that they might have when it comes to their abuse or when they are having sex again, having flashbacks of being abused again, or that dissociation that we talked about. And then confusion with sexuality. And there's so much more that can be a regression, but for me, I feel like sex is something that's not talked about in our society, and sex after a sexual assault is even less discussed. So this is why I think this podcast topic is important, to give people information about sex after sexual assault, and how practitioners need to become more comfortable talking about sex with their clients to help them navigate through this sexual healing journey. Because a lot of clients come in and they're scared to talk about sex, when we really need to be more sex positive and ask them questions more about their sex life and how they're doing after a sexual assault, because it does, affect so much different parts of their relationships, either with themselves or with other people.
I think that's such a great point, and it sheds light on why really, reclaiming intimacy can be so difficult. If you think about like the feelings of guilt that may arise as a result of a sexual assault, and then later going through treatment and having a setback, those feelings of guilt could be compounding, right? It could start a cycle that's hard to stop and get out of. And that's why trained clinicians are so important, because they understand how to manage all of those dimensions of recovering from trauma, and finding a healthy sexual life.
Definitely. And I wanted to ask you, Jorge, as a final question, does Valencia offer any additional courses or lecture series that address the psychological impact of surviving a sexual assault?
I don't think anybody does enough, but yes, Valencia does a few things. Victim Service Center is a great partner to Valencia generally as well, and I know that there are. So at Valencia, we have something called skill shops, which are free workshops for students, and they don't. We prefer that they sign up, but they don't. You could really walk into one of these things as a student. They're free. They're going on all year long. And even as we're transitioning we're in the middle of a period of being strictly online. Even then, these skill shops are widely available. As soon as a pamphlet is available, I'll make sure that you get one for the next academic year. But they vary in topics, and so Victim Service Center will come in and do the sexual assault awareness and prevention, or the healthy dating relationships. We have some internal programs as well. A Be the One campaign. We call it Be the One is the name of the campaign. And it focuses on a couple of different things, including like bystander intervention, consent, things like that. Actually, bystander intervention could be another really good podcast in case you needed some ideas.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. We have some student run events as well. We have a team of students that we call the Wellness Ambassadors. So they work for the college, their work study, and they will hold some of these skill shops as well. The one that I think they're doing this year is called recognizing the signs of emotional abuse. And then there's another one that's it's called relationships, ignoring all the red flags. So there's a couple of different things that we try to do at the college.
Wonderful. Yeah, I love that Valencia has those skill shops. It's a great opportunity to have community members come in and teach really awesome topics. I'm lucky that, the VSC is able to present, and then we can see all the different presenters as well. Seems like definitely something to take advantage of if you're a student at Valencia, for sure. So thank you for sharing that, Jorge.
You're welcome.
Alexa, as a final question to you, for someone who hasn't sought help for a past sexual assault, what are some signs that indicate their sexual relationships may benefit from seeking the help of an organization like the Victim Service Center?
Some signs that a potential individual can look for is that if they are experiencing any of the following, such as pain during sex, fear of having sex, dissociating during sex, flashbacks of abuse, inability to feel safe during sex, not being able to trust their partner, or having difficulties communicating with their partner about sex. And I'm sure there's many more signs as well, but it's important to know at VSC that you do not need to know all the signs right away. Just calling our office and saying you want services is the first step in seeking help, and hopefully with the help of our advocates or therapists, they can help a client target those signs more clearly and work towards your healing journey. But just know that you don't have to have everything all together before you come to VSC. We're very open with talking to clients right after the sexual assault and working patiently with each client at their own speed.
Can I add something to that too? For the supporters of the survivor, be patient. Sexual trauma, sexual assault. One of the things that is a really important feature of this is loss of control. And part of the goal of healing is regaining control. And very often, I think about myself, I know I would have a hard time. I would have an impossible time being the supporter of someone that had this, especially if it was a family member. I'm a parent of adolescent daughters, and so to think how I might react, if one of them went through something so terrible, so traumatic. But I would encourage supporters and family members, be patient, and help your loved one regain control, regain their trust in the world.
I think that's a wonderful place to kind of sign off. But before we do, is there anything else that you, Jorge, or you, Alexa, would like to add before we say goodbye here?
Yeah, I really appreciate, Jorge, you talking about the partners or even the family members. I think that's extremely important for viewers to know that is going to take some time, and to have compassionate for, sexual assault survivors as well. And, I also wanted to make another note as well. I know that we are talking about sex after a sexual assault, and I want to make sure that our viewers know that not all humans are sexual beings, and there's going to be an umbrella term for people who do not have interest in sex, and that is someone who is ace or asexual. So it's important to know that someone who is asexual doesn't have sex because they're afraid or that they're choosing to be celibate. It's important to know that sexual abuse doesn't cause asexuality. So if you're listening to us and you're thinking, I'm not even interested in having sex, doesn't mean that that's because I was abused. That's not going to be the answer. It's going to be that you were born that way, just like as if someone's born with being heterosexual, pan, or homosexual. Asexuality is just one of those other identities that we're born with. So knowing that it's not a choice, and if you might think that you are asexual, you can definitely look up more information. The Trevor Project website is known for LGBTQ plus positive information. So I just definitely wanted to add that as well, because we might have some viewers who do not resonate with sex being a part of their lives.
That is such a great point. I kind of wish we had said that earlier, just as we were talking about this. I know we started talking about, people who are in relationships or interested in having relationships. But I think, kind of like you said too, I think, even if you don't have an interest in pursuing a romantic relationship with another person, if you are a victim of sexual assault, it can still be helpful to seek counseling, because the trauma can have negative effects on other parts of your life as well.
Definitely. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. But yeah, I definitely think it is important, to understand, wherever your sex life is, there doesn't have to be one, there could be one. But yeah, I definitely, emphasize, just going to a counselor and be able to get that help, because, sexual assault is going to affect you in so many different ways than just sex.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful place to sign off. So I wanted to just thank the viewer for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, just like Alexa and Jorge have mentioned, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Alexa and Jorge, for joining me today.
Thank you, Emilie.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I had a great time again.